The morning rain had left the streets of Cedar Grove glistening like polished glass. Margaret Chen stood at the window of her small rental house, watching the water drip from the eaves while her two children ate breakfast behind her. The neighborhood had changed so much in the 5 years since she and her husband David had moved here, back when the houses were modest and the people were kind. Now massive homes loomed over the older properties, their owners looking down, both literally and figuratively, on those who couldn't afford to keep up with the transformation. "Mom, can I have more cereal?" 8-year-old Lucas held up his empty bowl, his dark eyes bright despite the grey morning. Margaret turned from the window with a soft smile. "Of course, sweetheart." She walked to the kitchen, her worn slippers making soft sounds against the linoleum floor. The box was nearly empty. She'd have to stretch the grocery budget again this week. 12-year-old Sophie looked up from her homework, her brow furrowed. "Mom, are you okay? You've been standing at that window for like 20 minutes. "I'm fine, honey. Just watching the rain." Margaret poured the last of the cereal into Lucas's bowl, making a mental note to add it to the list she couldn't afford to fill completely. The truth was, Margaret had been watching the construction crew across the street. For 3 months now, they'd been building an addition to the already enormous house that belonged to the Harrington family. The constant noise, the trucks blocking the street, the workers trampling through her small front yard to take shortcuts. It had become unbearable. But every time she tried to speak to Victoria Harrington about it, the woman looked at her as if she were an insect that had wandered into her champagne. David had died 2 years ago. A sudden heart attack at 42 that had left Margaret alone with 2 children, a mountain of medical debt, and a world that suddenly seemed determined to crush her. He'd been the breadwinner, the planner, the one who'd made everything work. Without him, Margaret had taken whatever jobs she could find, cleaning houses, working the early shift at the diner on Main Street, tutoring kids in math during the evenings. She was surviving, but barely. "Sophie, finish your homework. Lucas, eat your breakfast. The bus will be here in 15 minutes. Margaret moved through the morning routine on autopilot, packing lunches with the last of the bread and the cheese that was starting to go hard at the edges. She'd eat a late breakfast at the diner. The cook always let her have whatever was about to be thrown out. The children gathered their things and headed for the door. Margaret followed them out to the porch, watching them walk down the cracked concrete path to the sidewalk where they'd wait for the school bus. The rain had stopped, but the yard was a mess of mud and puddles, churned up by the construction trucks that insisted on using her driveway as a turnaround point despite her protests. That's when she saw Victoria Harrington emerge from her front door, dressed in white linen pants and a silk blouse that probably cost more than Margaret's monthly rent. Victoria was on her phone, gesturing dramatically with her free hand as she talked. Her blonde hair perfectly styled, her makeup flawless even at 7:30 in the morning. Behind her came her husband, Richard, a corporate lawyer who'd barely acknowledged Margaret's existence in the 3 years they'd been neighbors. Margaret took a deep breath. Today was the day. She'd been putting it off for weeks, but the construction crew had knocked down her mailbox yesterday, and no one had said a word about replacing it. She needed that mailbox. Her disability paperwork, the kids' school notices, everything came through the mail. She couldn't afford to keep driving to the post office. "Mrs. Harrington," Margaret called out, stepping off her porch and walking toward the property line. "Could I speak with you for a moment?" Victoria paused, holding up one finger without looking at Margaret. "Hold on, Diane. Some woman is trying to talk to me." She finally turned, her eyes traveling up and down Margaret's figure. The faded jeans, the oversized sweater with a small hole in the sleeve, the hair that hadn't been professionally cut in over a year. "Yes? What is it?" Margaret swallowed her pride. She'd done it 1,000 times before. Once more wouldn't kill her. "Your construction crew knocked down my mailbox yesterday. I was wondering if you could ask them to replace it." Victoria's perfectly shaped eyebrows rose. "My construction crew. I hardly think they would have touched your property." "I saw it happen, Mrs. Harrington. One of the trucks backed into it. I have it on my doorbell camera." Something flickered in Victoria's eyes, annoyance perhaps, or something darker. "Well, I'm sure if there was any damage it was accidental. These things happen during construction. Perhaps you should look into getting renter's insurance." "I have renter's insurance. It doesn't cover damage caused by other people's contractors. Mrs. Harrington, I'm not asking for much. Just a replacement mailbox. The same kind I had before. It couldn't cost more than $50. Victoria laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that made Sophie and Lucas turn from where they stood at the bus stop. $50? Is that really all this is about? My goodness, I had no idea things were so dire for you. Margaret felt her cheeks flush. It's not about the money, it's about taking responsibility. Responsibility. Victoria stepped closer, her heels sinking slightly into the wet grass at the edge of her property. Let me tell you something about responsibility. I've lived in this neighborhood for 3 years, and in that time, I've watched your house become an eyesore. Your gutters are falling off, your fence is rotting. Your children leave their bicycles in the front yard like this is some kind of trailer park. Do you have any idea what that does to property values? And you have the audacity to come to me about a mailbox? My house is not your concern. It absolutely is my concern when I'm trying to sell this property for what it's worth. The Hendersons on the corner took 6 months longer to sell their house because buyers kept driving past yours and changing their minds. 6 months because you can't be bothered to maintain basic standards. Margaret's hands were shaking. She clasped them together to hide it. I'm a single mother with 2 children. I work 3 jobs. I do my best. Your best isn't good enough, is it? Victoria's voice had risen now, carrying across the quiet morning street. Your husband died and left you with nothing, and now the rest of us have to suffer for his poor planning. Perhaps if you'd married someone with actual ambition— Don't you dare talk about my husband. The words came out harder than Margaret intended, cutting through Victoria's monologue like a blade. Victoria's eyes widened, then narrowed. Excuse me? I said don't talk about my husband. You didn't know him. You don't know anything about him, or about me, or about what we've been through. I came over here to ask a simple question about a mailbox that your workers destroyed. That's all. I didn't come here to be insulted. The school bus appeared at the end of the street, its yellow bulk rounding the corner with a squeal of brakes. Sophie and Lucas were watching now, their faces pale with worry. Margaret had always tried to shield them from the harsher realities of their situation, but there was no hiding this, not when Victoria was practically shouting. You want to talk about insults? Victoria took another step forward, right into the muddy strip between their properties. Living next to you has been an insult. Looking at your pathetic excuse for a home every day has been an insult. Watching you shuffle around like some kind of ghost, dragging those children through your miserable existence. That's the real insult here. Something in Margaret snapped. Not in an explosive way, more like a thread finally breaking after being pulled too tight for too long. She stood straighter, looked Victoria directly in the eyes, and said very quietly, I think this conversation is over. She turned to walk back to her porch, to wave goodbye to her children, to pretend this hadn't happened. But as she turned, her foot caught on a root that the construction crew had exposed when they'd driven over her lawn. She stumbled, arms pinwheeling, and felt herself falling toward the muddy ground. What happened next would replay in Margaret's mind for months afterward. She felt a hand on her back, not catching her, not steadying her, but pushing. A deliberate shove that sent her face first into the cold, wet mud. She landed hard, the breath knocked out of her, mud spattering across her face and filling her mouth with its gritty, metallic taste. For a moment there was silence. Then she heard Lucas screaming. "Mommy! Mommy!" Margaret pushed herself up onto her hands and knees, mud dripping from her face, her hair, her clothes. She heard footsteps running toward her, Sophie and Lucas, abandoning the bus stop, ignoring the yellow vehicle that had pulled up and opened its doors. "Kids, it's okay. I'm okay." She got to her feet, wiping mud from her eyes with a shaking hand. Lucas was crying, his small body pressed against her muddy legs. Sophie was staring at Victoria with an expression that no 12-year-old should ever wear. Pure, burning hatred. Victoria stood exactly where she'd been, her hand still slightly extended. Her face had gone pale, and for just a moment Margaret thought she saw something like fear in those cold blue eyes. But it was quickly replaced by a smirk. "You should watch where you're walking," Victoria said. "These older properties really aren't well maintained." The school bus honked. The driver, a middle-aged woman named Helen, who'd been driving this route for 15 years, had seen everything. Her mouth was hanging open in disbelief. "Sophie, Lucas, you need to get on the bus." Margaret's voice sounded strange to her own ears, too calm, too controlled. "Mom, I'm not leaving you." "Sophie, get on the bus. Take your brother. I'll be fine." Sophie's face crumpled, but she took Lucas's hand and began walking back toward the waiting bus. Lucas kept looking over his shoulder, tears streaming down his face. When they finally climbed aboard, Helen gave Margaret a long, meaningful look before pulling the door closed. Margaret stood in her muddy yard, covered in filth, and watched the bus drive away with her children. She could feel Victoria still standing there, watching her, probably waiting for her to cry or scream or do something that would prove she was every bit as low class as Victoria believed her to be. Instead, Margaret turned and walked back into her house without another word. She didn't go to work that day. She called in sick for the first time in 2 years, then stood in the shower until the hot water ran out. The mud swirled down the drain, but the feeling of that hand on her back, the deliberate, malicious push, that wouldn't wash away. Margaret Chen had been knocked down before. Life had taught her that lesson repeatedly over the past 2 years, but she'd always gotten back up, always kept moving forward, always focused on survival rather than revenge. What else could she do? She was just one woman with 2 children, and nothing to her name but debt and determination. But as she stood in her small bathroom, staring at her reflection in the foggy mirror, something fundamental shifted inside her. She thought about Lucas's screams, about Sophie's face, about the way Victoria had smirked, as if pushing another human being into the mud was some kind of joke. This wasn't just about her anymore. This was about her children watching their mother be humiliated and degraded. This was about teaching them that the world was divided into people who pushed and people who fell, and that they would always inevitably be among the fallen. Margaret had spent her whole life being careful, being polite, being the kind of person who didn't make waves. Where had it gotten her? Face down in the mud while a woman in $1,000 shoes laughed. She dried off, got dressed, and sat down at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee and a legal pad. For the next 3 hours, she wrote. She wrote down everything she knew about Victoria Harrington, which wasn't much. She wrote down everything she knew about the construction project, the permits, the violations she'd noticed, the corner cutting she'd observed. She wrote down the names of every neighbor who'd complained, every regulation that might have been broken, every possible avenue for holding someone accountable. By the time Sophie and Lucas came home from school, Margaret had filled 15 pages with notes. She hid the legal pad in a drawer and greeted her children with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mom, are you okay? What happened this morning?" Sophie's voice was trembling. "That woman pushed you. I saw it. Lucas saw it. We told Mrs. Helen on the bus, and she said—" "I know what happened, sweetheart." Margaret knelt down and pulled both children into a hug. "And I want you to know that it's not okay. What that woman did was wrong. But I'm going to handle it." "How?" Lucas asked, his voice small. "She's rich. Dad always said rich people can do whatever they want." Margaret pulled back and looked her son in the eyes. "Your father was wrong about that. Rich people can't do whatever they want. They just think they can. And sometimes it takes a while for them to learn otherwise. But they learn. Eventually, everyone learns." Sophie was studying her mother's face with an intensity that was almost uncomfortable. "You're different," she said finally. "Something's different." Margaret smiled. A real smile this time, though it had an edge to it that hadn't been there before. "Maybe I am, sweetheart. Maybe I am." That night, after the children were asleep, Margaret sat down at her second-hand laptop and began researching. She looked up local housing codes, contractor licensing requirements, easement laws, and noise ordinances. She read about civil suits and small claims court and the process for filing complaints with the city. She read about Victoria Harrington, about her husband's law firm, about her involvement with local charities, about the society pages that featured her at various galas and fundraisers. And she read about herself. Before she'd married David, before she'd become a mother and a widow and a woman who cleaned other people's houses for a living, Margaret Chen had been someone else. She'd graduated summa cum laude from Berkeley with a degree in business administration. She'd worked for a management consulting firm in San Francisco, climbing the ladder faster than anyone in her hiring class. She'd been on track to become a partner before she'd met David, before love had rearranged her priorities, before she'd chosen family over career and never looked back. She'd thought those skills were gone, atrophied from years of disuse, but as she read and planned and organized her thoughts, she felt them coming back. The analytical thinking, the strategic planning, the ability to see systems and find their weaknesses, it was all still there, waiting to be used, to be. Margaret didn't want revenge. Revenge was petty and small and ultimately self-defeating. What she wanted was justice. She wanted accountability. She wanted Victoria Harrington to understand that actions had consequences, even when the person you'd wronged was poor and powerless. But more than that, Margaret wanted her children to see their mother stand up and fight back. She wanted them to learn that dignity wasn't something you were given. It was something you claimed, sometimes by force if necessary. The next morning, Margaret got up early and put on the nicest clothes she owned. A pair of black slacks that were slightly too big and a blue blouse that had been hanging in her closet since her consulting days. She fixed her hair, put on a little makeup for the first time in months, and looked at herself in the mirror. "Okay," she said to her reflection, "let's begin." Her first stop was the city planning office. The clerk behind the counter, a tired-looking woman named Janet, glanced up with the weary expression of someone who expected to be asked something tedious. "I'd like to request copies of all permits filed for the property at 4521 Cedar Grove Lane," Margaret said, "along with any inspection reports, variance applications, and correspondence related to the ongoing construction project." Janet's eyebrows rose slightly. "That's quite a request. Are you a lawyer?" "No, I'm a concerned citizen exercising my right to access public records." Janet stared at her for a long moment, then smiled. "Well, all right then. It'll take about a week to pull everything together. There's a small copying fee." "That's fine." Margaret filled out the necessary forms, paid the fee with money she'd been saving for new shoes for Lucas, and left with a receipt and a date when the documents would be ready. Her next stop was the city council member's office. She waited for an hour and 45 minutes before being admitted to see Councilwoman Rivera, a no-nonsense woman in her 60s who'd been elected on a platform of protecting working families from displacement. "Mrs. Chen, what can I do for you?" Councilwoman Rivera gestured for Margaret to sit. Margaret sat. "I want to talk about what's happening in Cedar Grove, the luxury developments, the way long-time residents are being pushed out, the construction projects that seem to ignore zoning regulations and noise ordinances. I want to understand what the city is doing about it and how I can help." The councilwoman leaned back in her chair and studied Margaret with new interest. "Most people come in here to complain. They don't offer to help." "I'm not most people." The conversation lasted 2 hours. By the end of it, Margaret had learned more about the politics of development in Cedar Grove than she'd known existed. She'd learned about the developers who donated to political campaigns, the inspectors who looked the other way, the legal loopholes that allowed wealthy homeowners to do essentially whatever they wanted while their poorer neighbors suffered. She'd also learned about the community organizations fighting back, the lawsuits pending, the investigative journalists who'd been sniffing around. And she'd learned about Victoria Harrington's husband, Richard. His law firm, it turned out, represented several of the developers who'd been transforming Cedar Grove from a working-class neighborhood into a playground for the wealthy. There were questions about conflicts of interest, about whether the Harrington construction project had received preferential treatment, about permits that had been approved suspiciously quickly. "There's a community meeting next Tuesday at the Methodist Church," Councilwoman Rivera said, as Margaret prepared to leave. "You should come. Bring your neighbors." "I will," Margaret said. "Thank you for your time." She left the councilwoman's office with a folder full of documents and a head full of ideas. For the first time since David's death, she felt something other than the dull ache of survival. She felt purpose. Over the following weeks, Margaret became a fixture at community meetings, planning board hearings and city council sessions. She learned to speak in public without her voice shaking. She learned the names of every relevant official, their positions on development issues, their voting records. She learned to network, to build alliances, to present complex information in ways that moved people to action. The other residents of Cedar Grove noticed, the ones who'd been struggling just like her, watching their neighborhood transform around them, feeling powerless against forces too big to fight. They noticed that someone was finally fighting back. Tom Patterson, who'd lived in Cedar Grove for 40 years and watched his property taxes triple in the last decade, started attending meetings with Margaret. So did Maria Santos, a nurse whose house had been damaged by vibrations from construction next door. So did the Hendersons, who'd been trying to sell their house for 2 years and kept getting lowballed because the neighborhood was in transition. They formed an organization, the Cedar Grove Residents Alliance. Margaret didn't want to lead it, but somehow she ended up at the front of the room at every meeting, explaining legal strategies, organizing petition drives, coordinating with journalists and lawyers and elected officials. Victoria Harrington noticed too. The first sign came about 6 weeks after the incident in the mud. Margaret was walking home from the grocery store when a silver Mercedes pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Victoria's perfect features, twisted into something that might have been concern, but looked more like calculation. "Margaret." Victoria had never used her first name before. "I've been hearing that you've been involved in some community organizing." Margaret kept walking. "That's right." The Mercedes crept alongside her. "I hope this isn't about what happened between us. That was just a misunderstanding. You pushed me into the mud in front of my children." Margaret's voice was calm, matter-of-fact. There was nothing to misunderstand. Victoria's mask slipped for just a moment, revealing something ugly beneath. "Be careful, Margaret. You're playing a game you don't understand. My husband knows people. Important people." Margaret stopped walking and turned to face the car. "Your husband's firm is representing developers who are currently under investigation for bribery and permit fraud. 3 of your contractors are unlicensed. Your construction project is in violation of at least 6 different city codes, including one that allows the city to issue stop work orders. You've exceeded your permitted noise levels 47 times in the past 2 months. I know because I've documented every single one. And the easement your workers have been using to access your property. It doesn't exist. You've been trespassing on my land." Victoria's face had gone white. "How do you—" "I read, I research, I pay attention." Margaret leaned closer to the car window. "I'm not playing a game, Mrs. Harrington. I'm not even particularly interested in you. I'm interested in my neighborhood and my community and the people who've been hurt by developers and lawyers who think the rules don't apply to them. You're just a small part of a much bigger problem. But if you keep pushing, if you threaten me or my family, if you try to use your husband's connections against me, I will make you the center of attention, and I promise you won't enjoy it." She walked away without looking back. Behind her, she heard the Mercedes sit idling for a long moment before finally pulling away. The stop work order came through 2 weeks later. The city inspector, freed from pressure now that the community was watching, found 17 different code violations in the Harrington construction project. Work halted. Fines accumulated. The contractors, facing questions about their licensing, disappeared in the night and left the Harringtons with an unfinished addition and a mess of legal problems. But that wasn't the victory. That was just the beginning. Margaret's research had uncovered a pattern of corruption that extended far beyond one wealthy couple's construction project. The documents she'd obtained through public records requests, combined with tips from sympathetic city employees and information shared by other affected residents, painted a picture of systematic abuse. Developers paying bribes, inspectors looking the other way, politicians receiving campaign contributions in exchange for favorable zoning decisions. She took everything to a journalist named David Okonkwo, an investigative reporter at the local newspaper who'd been trying to crack this story for years. They met at a coffee shop on the other side of town, where Margaret handed over boxes of documents and spent 3 hours explaining the connections she'd uncovered. David looked at her with something like awe. "This is incredible. Where did you learn to do this?" Margaret shrugged. "I used to work in consulting, before I got married, before I had kids, before everything. I thought I'd forgotten all of it. Turns out I was just waiting for a reason to remember." The story broke 4 months after Victoria Harrington had pushed Margaret into the mud. It was front-page news, not just locally, but regionally. The investigation exposed a web of corruption involving 3 city officials, 2 major development companies, and a dozen wealthy homeowners who'd received preferential treatment. Richard Harrington's law firm was implicated in several questionable transactions, though Richard himself managed to avoid criminal charges by cooperating with investigators. The fallout was swift and severe. Officials resigned. Developers were indicted, new regulations were passed. The Cedar Grove Residents Alliance went from a small group of frustrated neighbors to a model for community organizing that other neighborhoods began to emulate. And Margaret Chen went from being the invisible widow next door to being someone people knew, someone people respected, someone whose opinion mattered. The community college called first, offering her a position teaching business courses to adult learners. Then came the non-profit, asking her to consult on their advocacy efforts. Then came the Small Business Development Center, looking for someone to help entrepreneurs navigate regulations and build sustainable companies. She took the teaching position, which let her set her own hours and still be home when the kids got out of school. The money wasn't great, but it was better than cleaning houses and working the early shift at the diner. More importantly, it was work that used her mind, that challenged her, that reminded her of who she'd been before grief had ground her down to a nub. A year after the incident, Margaret stood in her kitchen making breakfast for Sophie and Lucas. The house was still small, still modest, but it was no longer falling apart. The gutters had been fixed, the fence had been replaced. A neighbor's teenage son came by twice a month to mow the lawn in exchange for tutoring in algebra. Outside, the Harrington house stood empty. Victoria and Richard had separated shortly after the newspaper story broke. Richard moved to another state to escape the professional fallout. Victoria moved to a smaller house on the other side of town where no one knew her, and she could pretend to be someone she'd never been. The construction addition, still unfinished, had been torn down by court order. The empty lot where it had stood was now covered in grass, a reminder of overreach and its consequences. "Mom?" Sophie looked up from her phone. "There's something on social media about you." Margaret's stomach tightened. She still hadn't gotten used to being visible. "What is it?" "Someone posted that video again, the one from Mrs. Helen's dashcam." Sophie turned the phone around to show her mother. It was the video that had gone viral 6 months after the incident, when the newspaper story broke and people started looking for any footage they could find of the now notorious Harringtons. Helen, the bus driver, had come forward with her dashcam recording, which clearly showed Victoria pushing Margaret into the mud. The video had been viewed millions of times. Margaret had given interviews about it, talked about her journey from victim to advocate, become a minor celebrity in the world of community organizing. She'd even been invited to speak at a conference about civic engagement, which had terrified her until she'd actually done it and discovered that she was good at it. "The comments are really nice," Sophie said. "People are saying you're inspiring." Margaret took the phone and scrolled through the comments. Most were supportive, though she'd learned to skip past the inevitable trolls and critics. One comment caught her eye. "My neighbor treats me like this too. Now I know I don't have to take it. Thank you, Margaret." She handed the phone back to Sophie and returned to making breakfast. But something in her chest felt warm and full in a way she hadn't experienced since before David died. "Mom, can I ask you something?" Lucas was watching her with those serious dark eyes that reminded her so much of his father. "Of course, sweetheart. When that lady pushed you, weren't you scared?" Margaret considered the question seriously. Lucas was 10 now, old enough for honest answers. "Yes, I was scared. I was scared for a long time. But I decided that being scared wasn't a good enough reason to not do something. Sometimes you have to feel the fear and do the thing anyway. Because it's the right thing to do? Because it's the right thing to do, and because if you don't do it, who will?" Lucas nodded slowly, processing this. Then he went back to his cereal, apparently satisfied. Sophie caught Margaret's eye across the table and smiled. It was a smile that said she understood something important, even if she couldn't quite articulate it yet. Margaret smiled back and felt, for perhaps the first time since David's death, that everything was going to be okay. The spring fundraiser for the Cedar Grove Residents Alliance was held at the Methodist Church, which had become their unofficial headquarters. Margaret arrived early to help set up, carrying trays of food that neighbors had prepared. "Margaret," Tom Patterson called out from across the room. "Got a minute?" She set down her tray and walked over to where Tom stood with a woman she didn't recognize. The woman was dressed professionally, with the sharp-eyed look of someone used to assessing situations quickly. "Margaret, this is Patricia Valdez. She's with the State Attorney General's office." Margaret shook the woman's hand. "Nice to meet you. Are you here for the fundraiser?" Patricia smiled. "Actually, I'm here for you. I've been following what you've accomplished in Cedar Grove. The Attorney General is putting together a task force on housing corruption, and we're looking for community liaisons. People who understand both the legal framework and the lived experience. Your name keeps coming up." Margaret blinked. "My name?" "You've done remarkable work here. The documentation you compiled, the organizing you've done, the way you've managed to bring together people from different backgrounds around a common cause. It's exactly what we need. This would be a paid position, part-time flexible hours. You'd be consulting on cases, helping identify patterns of corruption, working with affected communities." "I don't have a law degree," Margaret heard herself say. "You don't need one. What you have is better. You have experience, credibility, and a proven ability to get results. Think about it. There's no rush." Patricia handed her a business card. "Call me when you're ready to talk." She walked away, leaving Margaret holding the card and staring into space. "You okay?" Tom asked. "I don't know," Margaret said honestly. "This wasn't supposed to happen. I just wanted to fix my mailbox." Tom laughed. "Life's funny that way. One thing leads to another, and before you know it, you're someone you never expected to be." Margaret thought about that as she finished setting up for the fundraiser. Someone she never expected to be. 2 years ago, she'd been a widow, barely keeping her head above water, invisible to everyone except her children. Now she was being recruited by the Attorney General's office. The path between those 2 points was strange and winding, marked by moments of despair and determination, failure and success. And it had all started with a push into the mud. The fundraiser was a success. More people showed up than expected, including several from outside Cedar Grove who'd heard about the organization and wanted to support it. They raised enough money to hire a part-time coordinator, freeing Margaret to focus on advocacy rather than administrative tasks. At the end of the night, as Margaret helped clean up, Maria Santos approached her with a nervous smile. "I wanted to thank you," Maria said. "When this all started, I was ready to give up. Sell my house, move away, let the developers win. But watching you, it made me believe things could change." "Things can always change," Margaret said. "Sometimes they just need a push." She meant it to be ironic, but as soon as the words left her mouth, she realized they were simply true. Everything she'd accomplished, everything she'd become, had started with that moment of humiliation in the mud. Victoria Harrington had pushed her, literally and figuratively, out of the quiet desperation she'd been living in for 2 years. The push had been cruel and malicious, but its effects had been transformative. Margaret didn't feel grateful to Victoria. That would be absurd, but she did feel something like recognition. Sometimes, the worst moments of your life become the pivot points that change everything. Sometimes the people who try to destroy you end up showing you who you really are. She drove home through the quiet streets of Cedar Grove, past the houses that had been saved from predatory developers, past the empty lot where the Harrington Addition had once stood, past the small homes and modest yards of people who were no longer invisible because someone had taught them to make themselves seen. Sophie and Lucas were waiting up for her, even though it was past their bedtime. They wanted to hear about the fundraiser, about how much money had been raised, about who had come, and what they'd said. Margaret told them everything, sitting on the couch with one child on each side, feeling their warmth and their presence and their love. She told them about Patricia Valdez and the job offer, about Maria's thanks, about Tom's joke about life leading you places you never expected. "Are you going to take the job?" Sophie asked. Margaret hadn't decided yet. It was a big step, a commitment to work she wasn't sure she was qualified for. But as she sat there with her children, she realized that her doubts were just echoes of the person she used to be, the person who'd accepted invisibility as the price of survival. "I think I am," she said. "I think I'm going to try." Lucas snuggled closer. "Dad would be proud of you." The words hit Margaret like a wave, filling her eyes with tears she didn't try to hide. She'd spent so long trying not to think about David, about what he'd think of what she'd become. It was too painful, too raw. But Lucas was right. David would be proud. Not because she'd found success or recognition, but because she'd found herself again, the self she'd lost somewhere along the way, buried under grief and exhaustion and the daily struggle to survive. "I hope so, sweetheart," she whispered. "I really hope so." That night, after the kids were asleep, Margaret sat at her kitchen table and called Patricia Valdez. It was late, and she expected to leave a voicemail, but Patricia answered on the second ring. "Margaret, I was hoping you'd call." "I want to take the job," Margaret said, "but I have conditions." "I'd be surprised if you didn't. Tell me." "I need flexible hours. My kids come first, always, and I want to focus on cases in neighborhoods like Cedar Grove, places where working families are being exploited. I'm not interested in high-profile takedowns. I'm interested in helping people who don't have anyone else to help them." "That's exactly what we need," Patricia said. "When can you start?" Margaret looked around her small kitchen, at the second-hand furniture and the children's artwork on the refrigerator, and the legal pad where she still kept notes on cases and campaigns. It wasn't much, but it was hers. She'd built it from nothing, and she was going to keep building. "How about Monday?" The summer brought changes. Margaret started her new job, which turned out to be exactly what Patricia had promised. Flexible, meaningful work that let her use skills she'd thought were lost forever. Sophie started high school, navigating that transition with the resilience that had become her defining characteristic. Lucas joined a robotics club and discovered a passion for engineering that reminded Margaret of David in ways that made her heart ache and soar at the same time. The Cedar Grove Residents Alliance continued to grow, spinning off into other neighborhoods, becoming a model for community organizing across the region. Margaret stepped back from day-to-day leadership, but she remained on the board, guiding strategy and mentoring new organizers. And she kept receiving messages, emails, letters, social media posts from people she'd never met, people who'd heard her story and felt inspired to fight their own battles. A single mother in Ohio who'd organized her apartment building to resist an exploitative landlord. A retired teacher in Texas who'd started attending city council meetings. A college student in Florida who changed her major to public policy after watching that viral video of a woman getting pushed into the mud and refusing to stay down. Margaret didn't think of herself as a role model. She was just someone who'd reached a breaking point and decided to break in a new direction. But if her story helped others find their own strength, their own voice, their own path from victim to advocate, well, that was something worth celebrating. The anniversary of the incident came on a grey November morning, exactly 2 years after Victoria Harrington had pushed her into the mud. Margaret didn't mark the day in any special way. She got up, made breakfast for her kids, went to work, came home, helped with homework, made dinner. A normal day, unremarkable in every way. But that night, after Sophie and Lucas were asleep, she went outside and stood in her front yard. The grass was neat, the fence sturdy, the mailbox, a new one, paid for by a settlement from the Harrington Construction Company, standing straight and proud by the curb. She looked across the street at the empty lot where the Harrington house had once stood. It had been demolished 6 months ago, after sitting empty for too long and falling into disrepair. A developer had bought the land and was planning to build affordable housing units, a small victory in a much larger battle, but a victory nonetheless. Margaret thought about Victoria Harrington, wherever she was now. She didn't feel anger anymore, or even satisfaction. She felt something closer to pity. Victoria had spent her whole life believing that power came from money and status and the ability to push other people down. She'd never learned that real power came from connection, from community, from the willingness to stand up and fight for something larger than yourself. Maybe she'd learn eventually, maybe not. Either way, it wasn't Margaret's concern anymore. The wind was cold, promising winter. Margaret shivered and pulled her cardigan tighter around her shoulders, but she didn't go inside, not yet. She stood in her yard, in the dark, in the cold, and felt something she hadn't felt in a very long time. Peace, not the absence of problems or challenges or struggles. Those would never go away entirely, but peace with herself, with her choices, with the person she'd become. Peace with the journey from invisible widow to community leader, from victim to advocate, from someone who accepted being pushed down to someone who helped others stand up. She thought about David again, not with the sharp pain of grief she used to feel, but with something softer, gratitude for the years they'd had together, pride in the children they'd raised, and finally, after all this time, acceptance that he was gone, and she was still here, still living, still growing, still becoming. "Thank you," she whispered to the empty lot, to the cold wind, to whatever force in the universe had taken her worst moment and turned it into a catalyst for transformation. "Thank you for pushing me." Then she went inside, locked the door behind her, and went to bed. The next chapter of her life was waiting, and she intended to be ready for it. 3 years after the push heard around the world, as one journalist had melodramatically called it, Margaret stood at a podium in the state capitol, preparing to testify before a legislative committee. Her hands were steady, her voice clear, her preparation meticulous. She'd come a long way from the woman who used to shake when speaking to neighbors. "Members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to address you today." She looked out at the sea of faces, politicians, journalists, fellow advocates, ordinary citizens who'd come to witness this moment. "My name is Margaret Chen, and I'm here to speak about housing justice." She told her story, not in detail. There was no need to relive every moment, but in broad strokes, The widowhood, the struggle, the incident with her neighbor, the organizing, the transformation. She told it not for sympathy, but for context. To help these powerful people understand why housing policy mattered, why corruption had real victims, why the decisions they made in this room affected lives far beyond these marble walls. Then she talked about the data, the patterns she'd helped uncover in her work with the Attorney General's office, the neighborhoods being destroyed by predatory development, the families being pushed out of communities they'd lived in for generations, the systematic exploitation that turned housing, a basic human need, into a commodity for the wealthy to hoard. She spoke for 15 minutes. When she finished, the room was silent. Then the committee chair, a grey-haired woman with sharp eyes, leaned forward. "Mrs. Chen, your testimony is compelling, but I have to ask, what do you think we can actually do? The forces you're describing, the money, the political influence, how do we fight that?" Margaret smiled. It was a question she'd asked herself many times. "You fight it the same way you fight anything, Madam Chair, one step at a time, one regulation at a time, one election at a time. You make it harder for the corrupt to hide, easier for the affected to organize, more costly for the powerful to abuse their position. You don't win overnight, but you don't give up either." The hearing continued for another 2 hours. Margaret answered questions, defended her positions, pushed back when committee members made excuses or dodged responsibility. By the end, she was exhausted but exhilarated. This was what she was meant to do, not just organize her own neighborhood, but help shape the policies that affected neighborhoods everywhere. After the hearing, she was approached by a young woman she didn't recognize. The woman was carrying a notebook and wearing an expression of intense determination that Margaret remembered seeing in her own mirror 3 years ago. "Mrs. Chen, my name is Amanda Torres. I'm a community organizer in Riverside. I've been following your work for years. I was wondering if you had time to talk." Margaret had a flight to catch, a job to get back to, children waiting at home. But she remembered being Amanda Torres once, desperate for guidance, hungry for someone who understood, searching for a path forward. "Of course," she said, "let me buy you a cup of coffee." They found a cafe near the Capitol and talked for 2 hours. Amanda told her story, a family displaced by gentrification, a father who'd lost his business, a mother who'd had to take 3 jobs just to stay afloat. She'd started organizing in college, learning as she went, making mistakes, growing stronger. Now she was trying to take on the developers who were transforming her city, and she didn't know if she was doing it right. Margaret listened more than she talked. She asked questions, drew out details, helped Amanda see patterns in her own experience that she might have missed, and she gave advice, not instructions, but suggestions. Ways to build coalitions, to navigate bureaucracies, to sustain energy for the long haul. "This work will break your heart," Margaret said finally. "You'll fight battles you can't win. You'll watch people you care about give up. You'll face enemies with more money and power than you'll ever have. But you'll also see victories. Small ones mostly, but they matter. And you'll meet people, amazing people, who'll remind you why you're fighting. That's what keeps you going. Not the wins, but the people." Amanda nodded slowly, processing everything she'd heard. Then she asked the question Margaret had been expecting. "How do you do it? How do you keep going when everything seems impossible?" Margaret thought about her answer carefully. She thought about the mud on her face, the sound of Lucas screaming, the feeling of Victoria's hand on her back. She thought about the nights spent researching, the meetings that went nowhere, the setbacks and disappointments that had marked every step of her journey. "I think about my kids," she said finally. "I think about the world I want them to live in, a world where people don't push other people into the mud, and if they do, there are consequences. A world where communities can protect themselves, where regular people have power, where justice isn't just for the wealthy. I don't know if we'll ever get there completely. But every step forward makes that world a little more possible, and that's enough to keep me going." She checked her watch and realized she'd missed her flight. She'd have to book another one, get home later than planned, apologize to Sophie and Lucas for breaking her promise to be there for dinner. But this conversation had mattered. Amanda Torres would go back to Riverside with new tools, new perspectives, new determination. She'd organize her community, fight her battles, maybe win some and certainly lose others, and someday, years from now, she'd sit across from another young organizer and pass on what she'd learned. That was how change happened. Not in grand dramatic moments, but in quiet conversations and small choices, and the persistent, stubborn refusal to accept injustice as inevitable. Margaret called to book a new flight, texted Sophie to explain, and headed for the airport. The work wasn't done, it would never be done, but she was ready for whatever came next. The summer Sophie graduated from high school was the summer everything came full circle. Margaret sat in the audience at the outdoor ceremony, Lucas beside her, watching her daughter walk across the stage to receive her diploma. Sophie was valedictorian, not because she was the smartest, though she was smart enough, but because she'd worked harder than anyone else. She'd inherited her father's stubborn determination, and Margaret liked to think her mother's recent capacity for reinvention. The graduation speech Sophie gave wasn't about achievement or success or the bright future ahead. It was about community, about the responsibility to leave the world better than you found it, about the power of ordinary people to make extraordinary change. 4 years ago, Sophie said, her voice carrying across the crowded field, I watched someone push my mother into the mud. It was the worst moment of my life up to that point. I felt helpless and angry and scared. I thought there was nothing we could do because the person who hurt us was rich and powerful and we were nobody. Margaret felt tears streaming down her face. She'd never talked to Sophie about including this in her speech. She hadn't known. But my mum taught me something important. She taught me that nobody is just a word that powerful people use to make regular people feel small. She taught me that communities are stronger than individuals, that persistence beats power, that the right thing to do is usually the hard thing to do. She taught me that getting pushed down isn't the end of the story. It's just the beginning. Sophie looked directly at her mother across the crowd. Mum, I know you're probably embarrassed right now. You hate being in the spotlight, but I want you to know that everything I've accomplished, everything I'm going to accomplish, starts with you. Starts with that moment when you got up from the mud and decided to fight back. You showed me what courage looks like. Not the absence of fear, but the choice to act despite it. The applause that followed was thunderous. Margaret sat in her chair, tears flowing freely now, Lucas's hand gripping hers. Around her, people she'd organized with, worked with, fought beside over the past 4 years were clapping and cheering, not just for Sophie, but for everything she represented. After the ceremony, there were hugs and photos and congratulations. Sophie was heading to Georgetown in the fall, planning to study public policy. Lucas, now a high school freshman, was already talking about following her there, though he was leaning toward engineering. Margaret stood slightly apart from the crowd, watching her children celebrate with their friends, feeling that strange mix of pride and loss that every parent knows. They were growing up, moving on, becoming their own people. Her job wasn't done. It would never be done, but it was changing, evolving into something new. Margaret! A voice from behind her, familiar but unexpected. She turned and found herself face to face with Victoria Harrington. The years had not been kind to Victoria. The designer clothes were gone, replaced by something more modest. The perfect makeup was faded, the blonde hair showing grey at the roots. But what struck Margaret most was the expression in her eyes. Not the cold superiority she remembered, but something closer to exhaustion, maybe even regret. Victoria, Margaret's voice was calm, neutral. I didn't expect to see you here. My niece is graduating, Jennifer Patterson, Tom's granddaughter. Victoria's voice was quieter than Margaret remembered, stripped of its sharp edges. I wasn't going to come, but she asked me to. Margaret hadn't known that Victoria was related to Tom. Cedar Grove was a small place in some ways. she supposed. Everyone connected to everyone eventually. "Congratulations to Jennifer," Margaret said. She turned to go, but Victoria's voice stopped her. "Margaret, wait, please." She turned back. Victoria was looking at her with something like desperation, as if she'd been waiting years for this moment and didn't know what to do now that it had arrived. "I wanted to say—" Victoria paused, swallowed, tried again. "I wanted to tell you that I'm sorry for what I did, for all of it." The words hung in the air between them. Margaret felt something shift in her chest. Not forgiveness exactly, but something adjacent to it. Acknowledgement, maybe? Closure. "Why?" she asked. "Why did you do it?" Victoria was silent for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "Because I was afraid. Afraid that everything I had could be taken away. Afraid that if I let anyone see weakness, they'd tear me apart. I looked at you and saw everything I was terrified of becoming, struggling, invisible, fighting just to survive. So I pushed you down because I thought it would make me feel stronger." "Did it?" "No." Victoria laughed bitterly. "It made me feel powerful for about 5 seconds. And then I had to live with what I'd done. I had to watch you become everything I pretended to be. Strong, respected, someone who mattered." She shook her head. "I pushed you into the mud, and you got up and changed the world. I had everything handed to me on a silver platter, and I destroyed it all. There's a lesson in there somewhere, I think." Margaret considered this woman standing before her, diminished, humbled, seeking absolution that wasn't really Margaret's to give. She thought about all the pain Victoria had caused, not just to her, but to the community, to everyone who'd suffered because of the corruption Victoria and her husband had been part of. But she also thought about her own journey, about the person she might have become if things had been different, if she'd been born wealthy, if she'd never known struggle, if she'd been raised to believe that her value came from what she owned rather than who she was. "I'm not going to say it's okay," Margaret said finally. "It wasn't okay. What you did hurt me, and it hurt my children, and it set off a chain of events that affected hundreds of people. You have to live with that. No apology changes it." Victoria nodded, her eyes filling with tears. "I know. But I'm also not going to carry hatred for you anymore. I did. For a while, it felt justified. But carrying hatred is exhausting, and I've got too much work to do." Margaret paused, choosing her next words carefully. "If you want to make amends, don't apologize to me. Find someone who needs help, really needs it, and help them. Not for recognition, not for absolution, just because it's the right thing to do. That's the only way forward I know." She turned and walked back toward her children, leaving Victoria standing alone among the dispersing crowd. She didn't look back. There was nothing more to say, and her family was waiting. "Who was that?" Sophie asked when Margaret rejoined them. "Someone from a long time ago," Margaret said. "It doesn't matter anymore." Sophie looked over Margaret's shoulder to where Victoria was walking slowly toward the parking lot. "That's her, isn't it? The woman who pushed you?" Margaret nodded. "What did she want?" "To apologize, I think. To understand why her life fell apart while mine came together." Margaret put her arm around her daughter's shoulders. "Some people spend their whole lives looking for someone else to blame for their problems. They never realize that the person they really need to confront is themselves." Sophie was quiet for a moment, processing this. Then she asked, "Did you forgive her?" Margaret thought about it. "I don't know if forgiveness is the right word. I let go of the anger. I stopped needing her to suffer. That's not quite the same thing, but it's close enough." Lucas joined them, holding his phone up. "Mom, Aunt Patricia called. She said the bill passed." Margaret felt a surge of joy. The housing protection bill they'd been fighting for, 2 years of testimony, lobbying, organizing, had finally made it through the legislature. It wasn't perfect. No bill ever was. But it would make a real difference for families like hers had been. Families struggling to stay in their homes, fighting against forces that seemed insurmountable. "That's wonderful news," she said. "We should celebrate." "Pizza?" Lucas asked hopefully. "Pizza," Margaret agreed. "And then we need to start planning for the implementation phase. This is just the beginning." Sophie groaned. "Mom, can you take one day off from changing the world?" "I could," Margaret said with a smile, "but where's the fun in that?" They walked together toward the car, the three of them, a family forged in adversity and tempered by time. Behind them, the graduation banners fluttered in the summer breeze, promising futures yet to be written. Margaret thought about the woman she'd been 5 years ago, struggling to survive, invisible to everyone, accepting cruelty because she didn't know there was another option. That woman felt like a stranger now, someone from a different life. She'd been pushed into the mud, and she'd emerged as someone entirely new. That was the thing about hitting bottom, she realized. It showed you exactly what you were made of. Not everyone discovered strength in their darkest moments. Some people broke, and that was understandable, even forgivable. But for those who found their footing, who refused to stay down, who used the fall as momentum for the climb, for them, rock bottom became a foundation to build on. Victoria Harrington had pushed a widow into the mud and expected her to stay there. She'd had no idea who Margaret Chen was going to become. But then again, neither had Margaret. And that was the most beautiful part of the story. Not the revenge, not the success, not the recognition or the influence or the legislation that bore her fingerprints. The most beautiful part was the discovery, the slow, painful, exhilarating discovery that she was stronger than she'd ever known, that everyone was stronger than they knew, that sometimes it took being pushed down to realize just how high you could rise. The pizza place was crowded with graduation families, but they found a booth in the corner. Lucas immediately started arguing with Sophie about toppings. Margaret sat back and watched them, her heart full to bursting. This was what it was all for. Not the politics, not the advocacy, not the never-ending fight against injustice. Those things mattered, but they mattered because of this. Moments of ordinary happiness with the people she loved. The chance to see her children grow into good humans. The privilege of being present for their lives. David should have been here. That grief would never fully heal, and Margaret had learned to live with it rather than around it. But she liked to think he was watching somehow. Not in any mystical sense, but in the way that the people we love become part of us, shaping our choices even after they're gone. "What are you thinking about, Mom?" Sophie asked. "Your father," Margaret admitted. "He would have loved today." Sophie reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "He would have loved seeing you become who you are. He always said you were meant for great things." "He did, all the time. Especially when you were busy telling yourself you weren't." Margaret felt tears threaten again and blinked them back. Enough crying for one day. "Well, I wish I'd listened to him sooner. Would have saved myself a lot of trouble." "I don't know," Sophie said thoughtfully. "I think you had to figure it out yourself. That's the only way it really sticks." The pizza arrived. Half pepperoni for Lucas, half veggie for Sophie, all for sharing. They ate and laughed and argued good-naturedly about nothing important. The graduation crowd swirled around them, other families celebrating their own milestones, their own moments of transition and hope. Margaret looked out the window at the street she'd lived on for over a decade now. So much had changed, the neighborhood, the community, her own life, and yet so much remained the same. People struggling and succeeding, falling and rising, hurting each other and helping each other in the endless, complicated dance of human existence. She thought about Amanda Torres in Riverside, fighting her own battles, about the hundreds of organizers she'd trained over the years, spreading out across the country, carrying the torch forward, about the young woman at the Capitol last month who'd told her that Margaret's story had inspired her to run for city council. This was her legacy, not the laws or the headlines or the viral video that had launched 1,000 think pieces. Her legacy was the people who'd learned that they didn't have to accept being pushed down. Her legacy was a generation of advocates who understood that power came from community, not wealth. "Mom?" Lucas was looking at her with concern. "You're doing that thing where you zone out and look really intense." Margaret laughed. "Sorry, honey, just thinking about the future." "What about it?" about how much of it there is, about all the things we're going to do together. She raised her water glass in a toast, to the future, whatever it brings. Sophie and Lucas raised their glasses too, to the future. They clinked glasses and drank, and Margaret felt that sense of peace settle over her again, the peace she'd found standing in her yard 2 years ago, the peace that came from finally being exactly who she was meant to be. The road ahead was uncertain. There would be more fights to fight, more losses to mourn, more obstacles to overcome. That was the nature of life, and especially the nature of the work she'd chosen. But there would also be victories, small ones and large ones, personal and political. There would be moments of joy so pure they took her breath away. There would be her children's graduations and weddings, and maybe someday grandchildren. There would be communities transformed, lives changed, justice served. There would be more pushes from people like Victoria Harrington, who used their power to hurt rather than help. But Margaret knew something now that she hadn't known before. She knew how to get back up. And she knew that getting back up again and again, no matter how many times you were knocked down, that was the only victory that really mattered. Outside, the summer sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Tomorrow there would be work to do, calls to make, meetings to attend, battles to fight. But tonight there was pizza with her children and memories of her husband and the quiet satisfaction of a life well lived. Margaret Chen, the widow from Cedar Grove, the woman who'd been shoved into the mud and decided to change the world, she was exactly where she was meant to be, and she was just getting started.